Welcome. I thought I will give a talk about what now and why now, but as usual, I start a course and things appear that I think are maybe necessary to be mentioned, especially to young upcoming composers. One is the question of how you rehearse music, and I have some rather technocratic advice that I think is musically maybe helpful. Do not sit in front of the ensemble with a score. Especially if you're in a hall, for Christ's sake, do not sit there, because what you are limiting yourself to is that you are moving your attention into being a computer cursor. And there is already a conductor. You do not need the viewpoint acoustically of a conductor, and you do not need to do exactly the same thing that he's doing to control if things aligned or if they are played well. If there are questions arising about the modes and techniques that need to be played with musicians on this level, they are certainly not going to be any trouble at all if you have to move the bow millimeter downwards or upwards. But when you put your attention into such a focus, you lose most of the musical attention of what is actually important, and that is the balance of sound. How do things progress in time? How does phrasing function? Is everything actually musically coming together? Because you're just moving as a cursor and not seeing the whole sentence. So you are just moving from one letter to another without keeping in mind what is important. And so I advise you strongly to have an eagle's view eye, go as far into the hall as possible, sit down, I would recommend without a score, and just listen. And then you will have the attention on what is musically and syntactically important. This kind of proofreading, you may need it with a high school orchestra. You do not need it with professional ensembles on this level. It will, I think, give you a musical perspective that is much more important for that, what is the interpretation of it. And that is not if the sul ponticello has to be or but it is the idea of how does the whole of a musical structure function as a musical narrative. And of course, acoustically, if you limit yourself into such a conductor's viewpoint, the level of reflections that you get is different than you get it in the whole acoustic reflections of the sound waves, which means that the blending and the focusing of spectral content as is heard in the whole is quite different. So get out of the microscope and move into a perspective where you are dealing with larger and more important things, because in the end, no piece has ever failed because somebody didn't pull the credit card on the piano or pitched sul ponticello in the right way. Music usually fails if it fails on fundamental problems of structuring and balance. So that would be my advice that I wanted just to give you, because I see in rehearsals that you move all too much in front of the ensemble. You are basically next to the conductor, and so there is no need for a second conductor, but there is need to listen with composers' ears and to check if what you are hearing is not a proofreading of what is graphically there in the score, but it should much more be a mental re-examining if this is the musical result of what you wanted to achieve. So that would be my first, not really sage advice. And now I want you to talk, and you can also talk, and there won't be any projection because at one moment I think your generation has tired of being bombarded with an enormous amount of PowerPoint presentations. What do you now? How do you proceed? So you probably all have studied compositions at different levels of academic training, and you wish to become a composer, which is a very noble thing, but it is also a question of aesthetic identity, because what does it mean to become a composer? Does it mean that you have a doctorate in composition, possibly? Does it mean that you are being recognized by peers and publisher as a creative person? Or does it mean that you have found a part of a aesthetical world that you claim to be your own? Now, most composers see this in a very reductive way. Being a composer means getting commissions and getting their music performed. But if we take out of the equation that part and its practicalities and impracticalities, we ought to think about how does the aesthetic apparatus for you personally work? What are the levels of reductive or non-reductive decisions that bring you to a solution? There is, of course, the question of being involved in a study program of composition, which certainly colors both your technical and your musical abilities and proficiencies. Now, it is a very strange art form, because music is primarily learned through imitation. It is maybe most decisively the art form where, due to the tradition of Western music, it is you get to the possession of that kind of knowledge or of that kind of technical proficiency comes through imitation that you learn through species counterpoint, fugue, historical composition, copies, and so on, because it is it is also the only art form where there is such a, let's say, very long study process in order to be capable to really master the syntax. You see visual artists going to school, and after 2 years they would be in a place of their own. Musicians have a enormously long period of education, and for composers it's usually an unusually long puberty up until the age of 50, where they have until they are young composers. Then they have approximately 5.5 years to become old masters, which makes it a very strange a strange existence. Now, you go into school and learn a lot about historical and contemporary composition techniques. There are certain compositional trends that come and go. There are certain compositional fashions that appear, that then composers get interested in. We had serialism, we had spectralism, we have post-spectralism. We have all kinds of different compositional practices. They sometimes tend to get grouped academically, so certain schools, certain teachers see it as their duty to be a certain kind of contemporary Notre Dame school of composition, and to help achieve a world fame level of their school of composition. Now, I don't know if it is very clever to adhere to those trends. When I was approximately your age, then new conceptualism was making shocking waves in German music, and now it sort of completely receded into the footnotes of musicological press. And to achieve an aesthetic world that you call your own, you obviously will go through different phases. Phases where you will be interested in certain compositional practices, in certain sounds, and phases in which you will abhor certain things. And now this is a very important part of becoming a composer, the way you will start selecting both aesthetical practices, musical practices, compositional practices, and how you relate your own music to it. Because it is just a fact that when something appears and it sort of catches the imagination of the musical world, then cloning starts as a process. So after Lontano was premiered in Donaueschingen, you had like for 10 years kind of a small Lontano after it that composers try to out-ligeti. Now, this is, in certain compositional practices, quite hard because they are either very limited to a set of rules or to such a personally adapted set of rules that they do become to sound clones. One of the compositional practices that is sort of borderline into cloning is spectralism, and the whole school of using frequential harmony, of using overtone structures, and their transformation that continued out of it. And of course, I understand the fascination. I do share it. There is a physical exhilaration that one gets with manipulating frequentially based harmony. There is obviously such an excitement in overtone structure-based harmony that, and of course, it is a communicative achievement that performers also engage in that kind of music. However, there is always danger. There is the danger, either the so-called serial danger, what happened to serialism when it becomes a procedure so automatic that it relinquishes the personality of the composer out of the equation. One of the practices that sort of sometimes takes this dangerous and treacherous path is computer-aided composition. If you look at an algorithm, at any algorithm, there is a set of logical sequences that will bring you to a certain solution. Now, because you are excluding the personal taste in a certain way in the moment that the algorithm is fixed as a function and it functions only as an automatic set of rules for a certain data set, then the resultant data set that you are getting out of the algorithm is as it is, which means you can automatize things. It is a fact of life that everything that exists as digital data, digital file, can be copied and can be manipulated. But music is also deals with the symbolic syntax, and so it is one thing to manipulate audio files as transformations into the domain of a digital. It is very hard for me to talk English because I've almost never talked in English for longer than 15 minutes. Recording is basically a digital set. When you manipulate it through different signal processing algorithms, you get a different set of a different you get oh my god, this is really ridiculous. You get a manipulated recording. Now, this manipulated recording can, in some ways, you can relate to the original recording. So between A and A manipulated, depending on what the manipulation is, you can see or hear, basically you have to hear it, that it shares a world. If you have an algorithmic structure in symbolic computer-aided composition, where you say, I have a set of notes, and I have a processing function here, and then I have a result. Now, if this processing function in between, it of course does not possess musical knowledge, it doesn't possess musical intuition, and it doesn't possess musical taste. It is just a set of rules that you have established to manipulate your symbolic set A. So the coming symbolic set out of it is something that is devoid of, let's say, taste. This can be great for a certain amount of reasons, and it can be terrible for exactly the same amount of reasons. Now, when you compose, let's say, just with your inner hearing on a staff paper, following the sound in your head, you are necessarily maybe playing it on the piano, maybe humming it on your head, playing it on your instrument, guitar, whatever. Necessarily, you have musical memory of events past, a precognition maybe of musical events that will follow, and you have a permanent intuition, this is right, this is wrong. This can be very limiting to a certain, in a certain way, because you again become this cursor. You are just moving from one point to the next, and it is hard to get out of the process, especially because you are not able to limit your taste, you're not able to limit your understanding, and you're not able to turn it off. So you are like, oh, this one note after the other, I don't like it. If it happens on a symbolic, through a manipulation of algorithm, it is completely, you say, I want A, I want the B to be here, and I want a transformational process that goes through a certain way. Now, there is going to be a certain grading inside that process, but the musical result is completely devoid of these local decisions. These local decisions are a hard thing, because on a fundamental level, music formally functions as a very complex syntax on all levels of formal meaning, which is, it is an intended sounding structure, it is an intended sounding, and that sound has a dominant formal meaning. So if you go outside and it rains, that is not music. If you take a microphone and you record it and you put it inside a formal set to listen to it, it can become music. Music functions when sounds, any sounds, have a formal syntactic meaning which give us the understanding that musical form is unfolding. Now, there have been dramatic repercussions to the questions of how musical form and its stability in the 20th century function. However, I do not adhere to the notion that the idea of a work, the idea of a finished composition is completely dead, that only open forms will exist, and so on. And most of you obviously do not, because you're writing instrumental music for a set of performers where there is a score, the music has a certain duration, and it exists in a certain sonic world. So it is obvious that most people are, or most composers still are interested into musical structures that have a formal meaning. So it is not open, it is a closed musical form. And then we get to the black box problem. A black box is a thing from cybernetics, which is completely intransparent compared to a glass box. So you do not know what is happening inside. And then it is used for testing transfer functions and such thing. But when you write music, you also are dealing with a black box. There is one black box, your performers, and there is another greater black box, the people listening to it. So ideally we know what's in the black box, because what is in the input and what is in the output can tell us something about the behavior of the black box. But for us to understand it, there have to be certain norms governing where we can deduce what was happening inside the black box. So both the performers and the audience obviously need to understand the internal working of that music. When I say internal, they do not have to understand what your compositional practice was, but what is the musical meaning of it. So it doesn't matter if you manipulated pitch sets or rhythmical structures or translated a recording and transcribed it for instruments or whatever. It generates, hopefully, a musical form that gives both the performers and the audience a feeling that they are inside of a closed aesthetic world. Now, the syntax of any compositional practice is a thing in itself. But the question is, how do you decide to take something inside your practice or to leave it out? So how do you process actually the world around you? And your world is much different than mine. We didn't have this abundance of information. We weren't this bombarded by sound and pictures and everything. I mean, there was television, but it wasn't a way of permanent connectedness to internet that basically is just a scrolling of everything. How do you focus musical attention in a world of that, in a world so obsessed with an abundance of imagery and sound? Now, some people retreat into monkish stillness. They sort of ignore the world and try to imagine a music writing as if they would be living in the 14th century, as if the world is an immovable category. But most people cannot blend out the world around them. It's very hard, so I am actually very interested to hearing what you have to say about that. Because I go and give these composition courses, and then people bring scores and bring pieces, and then we discuss if it's more efficient to write something like this, if we should be using beams, how the beams should be broken with rests in between, and how the chords and double and triple stops on cello work better. But the fundamental issue is because you're also all living in quite different cultural contexts, yet you are all here and willing to communicate with each other and obviously share a certain set of communicational patterns that you are able to interact in a very meaningful way, hopefully. So I'm asking actually you, how do you process this world and make it a compositional practice? Someone? Anyone?
I think maybe there needs to be a balance between, as you said, blending yourself in our reality, our context, but then also affording yourself the time and the space to take what you experience and commit it to a single idea or project. So maybe there's merit both in finding that monk-like state, as you stated, but also merit in, allowing yourself to be part of the larger picture, I suppose. But I think I would struggle to be constantly participating in the imagery and the noise of modernity. I think there's still a place for silence in the composer's life.
I mean, I don't have a smartphone, so...
Right, well, I mean, for example, I don't have any social media, for example. So I think different people have different ways of...
But is it because it is limiting your attention? Because it is pulling you away and bombarding you with information that is really non-essential, where you would... I mean, how many people have... people kind of always listen to music. They walk with their headphones all day. But I'm thinking, how many people are actually listening to music, like sit down and be in the passion and the discourse and the syntax and understand and wish to analyze it, not have it as a wallpaper.
Yeah, I mean, I forget which composer, but one individual was talking about how when he was studying 30, 40 years ago, they didn't have the access to all these recordings and scores that we do now. And so they would really have to pick one or two pieces that they were very passionate about and learn them in depth. And it kind of makes you think of Mozart and Beethoven, copying out the well-tempered clavier by hand. And to conceive of a composer now copying out 200 pages of one composer's music seems insane, I think, because we're so oversaturated with recordings and scores, maybe. So, but I mean, surely that bombardment can lead to its own kind of creative expression, perhaps, as well.
So I agree with you that we are being bombarded with information like constantly, but at the same time I feel like we are living in a world that more and more the kind of information that we receive is very much customized. So we tend to receive, I mean, even if it's not, even if it's not what we intend, we usually, all these algorithms and everything, they feed us information that we want to get. We want to hear and read and experience certain things. And I actually feel like it would be essential and crucial if we go after, kinds of information that we don't, receive, on a regular basis, and basically, expose ourselves into experiencing something that's very different, or even, the opposite of what we like and what we want to experience. And I think that would be, the difference would be whether we consume something, whether that's music. So I think, what you just said about having headphones and walking around with it all day without being, aware of that much, aware of the music and its content and its quality and everything. I think that part is consumption that, nowadays in this world we are always pushed to consume versus sitting in the room and just actively listening and experiencing and analyzing. So
Next one.
I think our generation, there's intense sensory overload, but I think in a way it can foster creativity, but you have to be really smart about it, I guess, and diligent. With all the streaming services, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, Apple Music, you can find endless, recordings, and but I think that it allows us to maybe find our aesthetic niche, maybe not more efficiently, but definitely we can seek out so many different aesthetics that we can kind of maybe more easily find what we like, and then we can kind of cultivate that in a way into our own voice. But I think that something that comes along with this is, with this technology, is the ability to be interconnected and to the networking possibilities. And when we go to these festivals and we meet so many people, but where we don't just say goodbye to them and maybe never see them again, we see them online. We can follow what they're doing. So I think in a way, as overwhelming as the technology that we have can be, I think it can be good for cultivating a community of new music, because we're all can be still connected over the globe, kind of find our people, even if they're not physically around us. Yeah.
But still, there is the question of obviously you all write instrumental music, and the idea of listening to instrumental music is much different in a concert because it is a communal setting. It is different in acoustic context because it is a much richer spatial experience than any type of recording, no matter how well it is recorded. And so, of course, not everybody is living in a place where they can just easily experience Berlin Philharmonic or Paris opera and stuff like that. But the need to be there, in the need to communicate through live musicians is obviously there. I mean, music is a strange thing because it doesn't have any. There is no silent culture on earth. There are many societies, but there is not a single that is silent. But music doesn't really have any type of, as they say, the psychology, evolutionary value. But it is obviously such a strong need in humans to communicate, obviously, emotion through organizing sound. And so some of us also work in the field of electronic music, but that is also not something that you actually want to listen at home with your headphones, even when it is just a great stereo two-channel piece. You need the physical sensation of sound is so elementary. It's also probably the explanation why spectralism and post-spectralism has had such a strong gravitational pull effect in the last 30, 40 years, is because the exhilaration that sounds create are both psychologically and physically overwhelming our senses. But the thing is, when listening, how do we know what is right for us compositionally? How do we? There are, of course, teachers. There are ideas about what is right in music, what is aesthetically valid. But what brings you to the point of being immovable about knowing nobody can tell me that I'm not right? I know this is right no matter what everybody else is saying. And there will be, of course, situations where you will sort of think this, why isn't this working? Why is everybody against me? And things like that. But this kind of aesthetic center that brings you to the point, I know this is immovably right. That seems to me to have become the hardest question in composing today. It's not the abundance of styles, it's not the abundance of technology, it's not the overwhelming sensation that there is a Babylonian-like Babylonian-like wealth of language that is not quite fostering the communication but making it impossible. But to get this deep sensation that you know this is exactly what you wanted. This is something that I ask myself, have I actually achieved what I wanted? When you start, then it's usually you move from one from what you want to achieve. Oh, I want to be able to write for a string quartet, and then I want to write a variational form. And so it is, you kind of move always in small steps, kind of trying to absorb musical and compositional technique. But beyond, of course, you should be capable of achieving a musical syntax and musical form of coherence, and that is technically well versed and such stuff, so to say, the part of the academic training that gives you the diploma of a composer. The question is, when are we musically right? Is something that has been on my mind quite lately, and I actually have absolutely no solution. I just have lots and lots and lots of questions about it. So the feeling of doubt, beyond the feeling of the doubt, about how successful you are, and if you will be able to make a living, and if we just leave out the whole mundane problems of being a composer and what that means, it is the question, how is this music right? Why is this music important? And what does it generate that this music is important for you personally or for the world? It sort of has been a preoccupation of mine. I would like to hear if you have any thoughts about how you get the feeling you're right, not thinking that you're right, but this feeling that you have overcome something and that you have landed into the right place. Yes?
Actually, I have many questions, like during my music journey. Well, I think when I was younger, I would like to show others who I am. But at some point, I start asking myself who I am. So I keep writing music and keep working with musicians. Slowly, I saw raise a core of my spirit, of my music. I'm still not sure, but maybe it's something related to individuality. Even though I'm writing different ensembles piece and maybe writing for installation, different form, but all those things there's a main core over there. And sometimes I didn't discover, but the musicians and other audience or observers, they could see it. So it's very interesting because I think all the composers they have a different character, and which is very, I think, very valuable. And especially nowadays, there are many information. Sometimes we got disturbed and distractions. However, I think nowadays there are more kinds of composers. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Well, I mean, it is obvious that there has never been a greater plurality of styles in musical composition ever. So this isn't the worst time to be living in. It is quite of a Renaissance-like state. And there, I've always sort of had a quietly despised older colleagues who have thought that the great times are behind us. This for me is just an unbearable thought that you would wish yourself to be living in Beethoven's time, and then you know how Beethoven composed, and you would compose exactly the same. I mean, insane. So the idea that the golden age of music is deeply past us, I don't think it is that. It is just that at least through, let's say, Western education, notation, and understanding a music that sort of came out of the instrumental composition of Western music. Of course, there are different kinds of music everywhere in the world, but when we look at Northern African drumming, we immediately can be only tourists in that musical expression. It can, of course, lead to something wonderful, like Ligeti using it as a model for his piano etudes. But there is this idea of sampling, and I do think sampling is a fantastic thing, that is both wonderful and dangerous. And I guess most things that are wonderful have to be dangerous to be wonderful at all. And it is, you can sample anything, both physically as a sound, and you can sample it both as something that you can copy into you can basically transcribe anything for instruments. You can transcribe any file into instruments. You can transcribe, you can use any compositional procedure that exists. And so when you are able to sample the complete world, and this is where we start living in real postmodernism, is that only now we have this Borges-like library of all knowledge, of all music. Everything exists. It isn't just the idea that there is a book of everything somewhere. It is right there. You can find it. Every single recording ever being made, you can access it. And so you're kind of confronted with the fullness of world that is overwhelming in a way that no composers before us even remotely had to think of. If you think of Mahler symphonies, because they would appropriate musical material out of music that wasn't considered symphonic, so post horn and you know, and march music and things like that. That was the idea of how he sort of would take his idea of a symphony. It is a complete world, that he incorporated, appropriated a few things that were immanently not in the symphonic practice. But now you really can out Mahler because there is nothing you cannot incorporate. And there is, of course, the thrill of discovering new things, but sometimes we have to get back to the thrill of rediscovering old things, maybe things we loved but fell out of love, and much more to return to such musical essences that we look at them always and in detail to see if we really thought we have discovered everything. It's a very strange thing. There are some scores that I have used to learn orchestration or something like that, and then use them for teaching. And I would say I know them quite well. And then every time I would pick the same score and the same thing, and I go in front of the students. At some moment it would hit me, oh, I still haven't seen this. It could be a detail, very minor, but something where I think the idea of art is, I guess, the need, the wish to experience it again. It is probably the opposite of a blockbuster movie, where it just causes you a vertigo of CGI effects, and then as the names of the thousands of people involved are wishing through, you have already forgotten it. And so I guess that is also what will make you a composer, is the wish that people play your music not just once and just, oh, we'll give a commission. Premiere is easy, but the wish of performers to play it again, because it's not just that they have to play a piece by a young composer, it is that they have a need to go back into that sound world. I have friends that are a wonderful string quartet, and then they tell me they have played this one Mozart string quartet so many times, and they still cannot get enough. And I think that is the mark of how do you. It is not just having a nice first performer somewhere. It is being able to send out the invitation for people to come back. Did I see a hand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I respond to
Yeah.
your question?
No.
Just about how do you know when you're right
Okay.
compositionally, which is that I'm so glad you're asking the question, because so often the discussion has nothing to do with that, like about the actual content, because it's such a personal experience as to whether it's right. And so much more often the conversation is more about marketing. Is it marketed right? And this actually, to me, has very little to do with the creative content. So I guess I'm happy that we as a group are reflecting on what it actually means to compose now, rather than just contributing to this swirl of noise, as it were.
I mean, the thing is, we are in a rather technocratic institution that is also an educational institution where people learn about computer music and about new music techniques. But these things, they do not... even when teaching, it is one thing if it's something playable, and that is always a valid... Okay, you want to say something?
So I think we're all thinking a lot right now, and I'm trying to think and follow some of your thoughts here, and about what it means to be right, and then your tangent on, or your elaboration on, repeated performances and wanting to kind of share the art. So I'm wondering, to be right, it seems like now there's a contradiction to as does it come from the inside out, or does it come from the outside in? Is it something that is an innate feeling that only you can discover for yourself, or does it come from the appreciation of those around you? And in that way, that kind of, to me, ties into the stuff that you wanted to avoid, which was music that can sustain your career, or that can, I don't know, like, is it art for yourself or is it art for others? And it opened up a lot of questions in my mind now.
Well, it is certainly not something that will bring you riches and fame in life, musical composition. It is certainly you have decided on this path because it is something that you cannot live out of your existence. And so beyond considerations, the mundane considerations of career and things like that, but there are fundamental issues about what do we deem essential in music. 70 years ago it was okay, we are not going to be tonal and we are going to use totally serial compositional practice and everything will be good. And then that fashion in a very limited space of kind of satelliting around Darmstadt kind of held 7.5 years. And of course it fell apart because some easy ideas do just that. But you will have, because you obviously have all studied composition, will have situations where you confronted by your teachers, something is not right and stuff like that. Now, I tended always to teach in the most technocratic way, in levels of to reduce what I think is not functioning into a set of technically manageable issues, in order actually to try to bring students to break down certain deeper structural musical let's say problems, where something sort of doesn't really work well, or it just doesn't accomplish what they were starting out to. But there is, of course, that moment where you have to leave the shadow of people who educated and influenced you, and where you sort of know, oh God, no, I will never orchestrate like that again. That is so academic, that is so old-fashioned, because that is the natural way, that is rather natural. It is sometimes strange and sometimes very unnerving when young people sort of become more reactionary than their alleged people who are older than them. How do you call that? Elders, yeah. So there is a moment, of course, where there is this kind of rainbow and shadow of influence. So you start composing, and there are composers who kind of color what you love and why you love it and how you think about music, and then you imitate things, and then you kind of start writing music, and then there are bits that are very colorful in your music, and then bits that are gray and sound like copies of others, and then these gray bits hopefully start disappearing and your personality appears, and then comes the moment, also when you sort of leave the shadow of, or kind of, you have to pull out of the gravitational field of composers who influenced you, because that's the troubling thing with gravity. You will either circle as a moon eternally, or you'll crash into something like a comet. So at one moment you have to pull out of the gravitational field. It's usually the moment, when sort of kind of the techniques, the static apparatus that was transported to you primarily through your educators all of a sudden appears old-fashioned and reactionary and stupid, and you just want to get away from that, and it just reeks of death and decay, and you want to be in a different land of living. So I do encourage you to be kind to your colleagues and to your educators and all people that you will professionally work with. But I also encourage you at some point to pull yourself out of the orbit of existing things. Don't be trapped in other people's gravity, because it will prevent you from if it prevents you from coming to your essence, if you are too long in somebody's orbit or gravitational pull or somebody's shadow, the only thing that is really valuable in life is time, and you have, well, I don't want to say little of it, but it's a limited amount of things. It is a limited amount of time you can spend. So at one moment, when the time is right, you have to pull yourself whatever way you can. There's a lot of people kind of radically move at some point, usually to a school or aesthetic coordinates that are completely different from where they were primarily educated. That is the need to cut yourself loose. So you have a lot of a lot of people think, the East European composers kind of coming to Germany, it is because the music life is so much better and well, it is usually also the need to kind of break away from a compositional practice that they were first in which they grew up in. It is that that need to get away out of it is very strong. So don't lose the right time to break free out of that. I think that would be all that I have to say, but I would love to listen to anything you have to say or ask.
As for a teacher and a composer, I graduated 10 years. After I graduated 10 years, right now I'm more thinking of who is the audience I'm facing to. So I think I don't think in school a teacher talks about audience usually because normally they tend to look at the music, and then afterwards, after I graduate, then I start to think, especially I'm not based in Europe, I'm based in Taiwan, which is my country, and I have to think what kind of music I should compose. Because I'm facing the audience from Taiwan, they are not quite familiar with something I learned or I listened in Europe or in Paris. Then I have to think about what kind the aesthetic, what's the musical form they would love to that I compose. But when I compose, I also think if I submit my music to some competition or something in Europe or North America, probably that's not quite favored by those the judges or something. So I would like to hear more from you about how you think about the audience as to compose and this kind of thing. Thank you.
Well, basically, I sort of kind of ignore the existence of audience. No, I ignore it in a sense that I primarily write for musicians, and so it's the musicians that I'm imagining when I'm composing, and it is now I sort of have my favored musicians and ensembles and conductors with whom I like working, and so I am rather non-promiscuous in that sense. There are composers who want to write for every orchestra and every ensemble, and I'm like the complete opposite. I want to have my string quartet, and that is my ensemble, and these two are my conductors. And because there is a level of communication that you adapt after a certain amount of working together, that makes the communication, makes the necessary things to communicate what's important, and essentially that music much easier. But to kind of tinder through ensembles, which I understand I really do understand that it is fascinating for people to try to kind of work with many ensembles and so on. It is, of course, a practical consideration, because when you're starting out, you try sort of to see where does your music fit in, or you have maybe an idea your music could fit in there or there, but will certainly be hated there. But until you try this out, you don't really know. You think you're writing music for an ensemble and they will love it, and then in the end they end up hating that music to such an extent that you're depressed for weeks. So I don't really think about the audience in a sense of who is listening to my music. I'm kind of happy if my performers are happy, or musically satisfied in a sense. That is my idea about. I don't believe in this kind of lamenting about the death of the audience and death of the concert and death of the opera and death of the symphony orchestra. It's like people have to write about something, so they kind of are. The easiest thing is to have the most catastrophic kind of, it's the death of the ensembles, it's the death of the string quartet and the death of the composer, and so nobody's dying. I think music is such an important thing for the human existence. You cannot. I really think if you would just make the whole world be in like silence for 3 days, people would actually understand what is the real value of music. If you would take away this incredible thing. Yeah. Yes.
So you just talked about the ensembles and musicians that you'd like to work with, and if they like your music, then it gives you, I mean, it makes it, I mean, that's basically what you're after, and it gives you a satisfaction. So I kind of feel like, what you just talked about, what you said about when the music feels right, when do we feel that what we've written is right, at least for you, comes from the validation you get from the people you work with, which is very, I think, which makes sense, which is very, legitimate.
But it's also the question of sometimes you are there and you're composing, and uncertainty is a great thing. Uncertainty on the level of a deep doubt is dangerous. Are people with religious fervor and knowing how it will go. Yes?
Yeah, I think I question this idea of knowing that you're right, because I've always been deeply suspicious of composers who feel so strongly that they're quote unquote right about the completion of a piece or something. And I think of, I guess it was No, I think, who became obsessed with that quote right at the end of his life, which roughly translated to like, wanderer, there's no way, only wandering, or something. But I think he sort of internalized his uncertainty, and that later music has great fragility and beauty, I think. And I don't think that he ever would have said that, upon the completion of one of these pieces, that he had found, the right, what did you call it, undeniable answer or something? Something like this. I think that notion itself is maybe antithetical to a curious investigation of an aesthetic, maybe.
There is also when I say when we are right, when we are the idea of what is success and what is failure, let's take out everything out of those two terms what people usually associate with. But I can say that I have maybe 2 or 3 pieces where I think I am at 91%. Those are like my absolutely best pieces, or maybe 90% that I ever could achieve. So I kind of always see my pieces, how much percent I actually did of what, I do. It is you. I mean, there are certain, aspects I put as kind of markers for me to know. Then it'll be good, better, best, and then we'll be at 80%. So, but this sense that something is right is an aesthetic sense. It isn't a technical sense of accomplishment. It is, you're composing, but, and then you think you're right, and then only at the first hearing, I had that maybe 2 times in life, where actually I was actually surprised, not how good it sounded or anything like that, but the feeling of the pull that it had on me. Because you write the music and you kind of know what comes after what. But anyway, the excitement of that musical form unfolding is always there. It is what brings us back to music again and again and again. And so I usually, when composing, I'm about, oh, this didn't succeed and this didn't succeed, and 2 bars here I have to change, and all the time I'm having this, such a failure, and again another failure. But beyond that, this sense that sometimes, very, very, very rarely, I mean, extremely rarely, there is this magical moment when I think this is just even better than I actually thought. And they're very precious moments. They happen very rarely. I mean, every 10 years.
Do you think does that feeling change in time? I mean, I think we all have had the experience of writing something that we are, quite happy with, at least in terms of, the amount of, energy and, emotional energy and time that we have invested, and then 3 months after, it feels like absolutely the opposite because something has changed. I don't know exactly what, but yeah, doesn't that feeling of, you know, feeling right or not right, doesn't that change in time for you, or?
Actually, it's become worse with time. So the way I know my technical competence, composing, making electronic music, increased, and that is something for which you actually need practice and time. So the type of internal virtuosity of syntax, that is something achieved through practice. So that increased, but the level of dissatisfaction and the level of deep doubt that everything is wrong, that just kind of skyrocketed. So we should all listen to the AC. Well then, young composers, I wish you all a very pleasant stay at Manifesta still, and good performances.